Emily Carter had once been the light of her school, the kind of girl whose laughter carried across hallways, drawing people to her like moths to a flame. At just 14, she was talented, bright, and full of dreams. Her father, Richard Carter, the CEO of one of New York's most powerful companies, adored her more than anything in the world. But after the car accident, everything changed. Emily survived, but her legs did not. The doctors had saved her life, yet her spirit had been left behind, trapped somewhere between pain and silence. Her wheelchair became both her cage and her lifeline. She moved through her father's luxurious mansion, surrounded by marble floors, chandeliers, and endless rooms, yet feeling smaller and lonelier than ever before. Her friends stopped visiting after the first few months, not knowing what to say or how to act. The girl who once ran track and loved dancing was now staring out of windows, watching life pass her by. Richard noticed, but he couldn't bridge the gap. He tried lavish gifts, tutors, therapists, but none could bring back her spark. Richard was a man used to control. In boardrooms, he made decisions that influenced millions of dollars. He spoke, and people listened. But with Emily, he felt powerless. She was his only child, the last reminder of his late wife, and the only reason he softened at all in this world of business battles. He had the money to pay the best doctors across the globe, and he did. Yet every expert came back with the same words: her injury was permanent. Hope dwindled, and Richard's empire of wealth seemed like dust compared to his daughter's pain. Emily's loneliness grew heavier by the day. She hated the way people looked at her, pity in their eyes, sympathy in their voices. The wheelchair squeaked sometimes, and she hated it too. It was a reminder of how fragile her life had become. The more her father tried to push her into therapies, the more she resisted, retreating into silence. She spoke little, smiled less, and sometimes cried when she was alone. In the middle of Manhattan's wealthiest neighborhood, Emily Carter was invisible, even to herself. On one gray afternoon, Emily convinced her driver to take her into Brooklyn. She wanted, just for a moment, to escape the suffocating mansion and feel part of the real world. The driver reluctantly agreed, knowing Mr. Carter would disapprove, but unable to deny Emily's pleading eyes. As they drove past bustling shops and narrow streets, Emily felt a strange sense of normalcy returning. But fate intervened again when her wheelchair began to wobble and break just as they reached a quiet corner of Brooklyn. The driver panicked, unsure what to do, but Emily insisted he let her out, stubborn even in her weakened state. That's when she noticed a small garage across the street. It wasn't flashy or modern like her father's buildings, just a humble workshop with tools hanging on the walls and a sign that read Brooks Auto and Repairs. The scent of grease and oil lingered in the air, but there was something comforting about it. She sat helplessly on the sidewalk until a man emerged. Daniel Brooks was 26, a mechanic who had inherited the small workshop from his uncle. He didn't have much in life, just his skillful hands, his honesty, and a heart that never let him ignore someone in need. When he saw Emily struggling with her wheelchair, he immediately rushed over. Kneeling beside her, his voice was soft, filled with sincerity. "Don't worry, I'll take care of it," he said. His eyes were kind, free of pity, and that startled Emily more than anything. She wasn't used to being seen like this. Emily's gaze lingered on him as he studied the broken parts. He didn't flinch at the mess or treat her as fragile porcelain. Instead, he asked her questions: how often it squeaked, what movements felt uncomfortable. She answered quietly, surprised at herself for speaking more than a sentence. Daniel nodded thoughtfully, pulling out tools and setting to work right there on the street. He was precise, wiping sweat from his forehead, focused not just on fixing a machine, but on making her feel at ease. Within an hour, the wheelchair was transformed. Daniel had tightened the loose wheels, replaced damaged bolts, and even padded the armrests with extra material from his workshop. When Emily moved forward, the chair glided smoother than it had in months. She maneuvered herself in a circle, her face lighting up in pure astonishment. For the first time in months, she wasn't struggling against her own chair. She was in control again. A small, hesitant smile broke across her lips, and Daniel noticed it with quiet pride. Her driver watched in shock as Emily's eyes sparkled, something he hadn't seen in ages. Daniel simply wiped his hands and stood, giving a modest grin. "It should be easier now, but if it ever gives you trouble again, come back, I'll fix it." Emily's heart fluttered with emotions she couldn't name. She had spoken with doctors, nurses, therapists, all of them talking about what she couldn't do. But this stranger, this mechanic, had given her something no one else had, a piece of herself back. Richard, of course, didn't know any of this yet. If he had, he might have dismissed Daniel as just another worker from the other side of the city. But Emily knew better. She wheeled herself back to the car, her hands steady, her smile lingering. For months she had been drowning in silence. But today, for reasons she couldn't explain, she felt hope again. Not because of doctors or riches, but because one kind soul had knelt beside her and said, "I'll take care of it." And so, a spark returned to Emily Carter's life, a spark that neither money nor power had been able to reignite. As the car pulled away from Brooklyn, she glanced back at the small workshop with its peeling paint and flickering sign. Something told her this wasn't the last time she would see Daniel Brooks. For the first time in a very long while, Emily's heart whispered a truth she dared not ignore. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as broken as she thought. Days after the chance encounter in Brooklyn, Richard Carter found himself unsettled. Emily had been speaking with a spark he hadn't heard in nearly a year. She talked about Daniel with a smile, her eyes alive as she described the mechanic who had knelt down and fixed her chair. Richard was skeptical at first. Surely it was just a kind gesture from a stranger. But when he visited Daniel's workshop unannounced, he was taken aback by the genuine warmth in the young man's voice and the way Emily's laughter rang through the garage like sunlight. Richard was used to men bowing their heads, addressing him with reverence because of his wealth and status, but Daniel didn't flinch in his presence. The mechanic greeted him respectfully, yes, but without fear or awe. He spoke plainly, explaining the adjustments he had made to Emily's wheelchair, showing Richard sketches of ideas he had for future improvements. Richard, who had spent fortunes consulting experts, realized in astonishment that this young man had accomplished something far greater. He had given Emily a sense of control, and that was priceless. Emily begged her father to let her visit Daniel again. Richard hesitated, worried about exposing her to false hope. Yet when he saw the determination in her face, he couldn't say no. So for the first time, he allowed her driver to take her back to Brooklyn. When she rolled into the workshop, Daniel's eyes lit up with recognition. "Back already?" he teased warmly. Emily nodded with an excitement that made her father's heart ache. He hadn't seen her like this in months. Against his instincts, Richard stayed quiet, allowing the bond to grow. Over the next several weeks, Emily spent more and more time in the garage. What started as routine wheelchair checkups turned into afternoons of shared creativity. Daniel noticed how Emily's fingers lingered on the tools, how her eyes brightened when she sketched little ideas on scrap paper. Instead of treating her like a fragile child, he treated her like a partner, asking for her input on designs, encouraging her to voice her opinions. It was subtle, but slowly, Emily began to feel seen again. One evening, Daniel looked her straight in the eye and said something she would never forget. "Your chair doesn't define you, Emily. Your courage does." The words landed deeper than he realized. For months, Emily had believed she was nothing more than her paralysis, trapped in a body that betrayed her. But here was someone who looked at her and saw strength, not weakness. That night, as she told her father about Daniel's words, Richard sat in silence, humbled by the way his daughter's spirit was shifting. Emily began to open up in ways no therapist had managed. She laughed again, small bursts at first, then full, unrestrained laughter that filled the workshop. She teased Daniel about his grease-stained hands, and he teased her about her competitive streak. Sometimes they sketched wheelchair designs together, her imagination blending with his practicality. Other times she challenged him to small races around the garage. Though she always lost, the sparkle in her eyes made every defeat feel like a victory. Richard often watched discreetly, marveling at the transformation. For the first time since the accident, Emily started to believe in herself. Daniel introduced her to small exercises she could manage while seated. He explained how strengthening even tiny muscles could give her more independence. He celebrated her smallest victories, like the day she managed to adjust her chair's brakes without assistance. To most, it was nothing. To Emily, it was a mountain climbed. Each accomplishment chipped away at the despair that had imprisoned her heart. Slowly, she was learning to live again, not just exist. Richard found himself lingering outside the workshop on many afternoons, listening. He was astonished, almost embarrassed, that a man with no medical training, no expensive equipment, had accomplished what specialists around the world could not. Daniel wasn't treating Emily's body. He was healing her soul. And as Richard stood in the doorway, watching his daughter laugh, he realized how profoundly out of touch he had been. His empire had made him powerful, but it had also blinded him to the simple truth. What Emily needed was not another doctor. She needed a friend. Daniel never asked for money, never hinted at favors, and never treated Emily as anything less than equal. His world was small, oil-stained floors, humming machines, and the faint scent of gasoline. But within that space, Emily was more alive than she had been in the sterile halls of hospitals. She told stories again, her hands moving animatedly. She spoke about her late mother for the first time in years, and Richard, overhearing, realized just how deeply she trusted this young mechanic. Her walls were crumbling, and in their place, hope was being rebuilt. One rainy afternoon, Emily arrived at the workshop to find Daniel waiting with a surprise. He had modified her chair again, this time adding lighter wheels and a smoother brake system. "Want to try?" he asked with a grin. She nodded eagerly, and when she pushed forward, the chair responded like never before. She zipped across the garage, laughing so hard her cheeks turned pink. Richard's eyes filled with tears as he clapped quietly in the corner. That laugh, he would give his entire fortune to hear it again, and thanks to Daniel, he had. Emily's world began to widen beyond the workshop. She started bringing her schoolwork, doing assignments, while Daniel tinkered nearby. Sometimes she helped him organize tools, joking that she was his assistant mechanic. Their bond was pure, built not on obligation, but on mutual respect. And Richard noticed something remarkable. Emily spoke less about what she had lost, and more about what she could still do. That subtle shift was more healing than any surgery. It was as if Daniel had reached into her heart and whispered, "You are still whole." Richard wrestled with conflicting emotions. He was grateful, undeniably so, yet part of him felt vulnerable. He was a man who solved problems with money, yet here was a solution he couldn't buy. Daniel had given Emily something Richard's billions could not: friendship, normalcy, and faith in herself. And though it humbled him, it also frightened him. What role could a mechanic truly play in his daughter's life? But every time he asked himself that question, he looked at Emily's radiant face and realized the answer didn't matter. For Emily, the days at the workshop became the highlight of her week. She looked forward to the smell of oil, the sound of Daniel's laughter, and the challenge of their wheelchair races. She began to draw again, filling notebooks with sketches of modified chairs, dream devices, and silly doodles. One sketch was of her and Daniel racing, her winning for once. She shyly showed it to him, and he laughed so hard he pinned it to the garage wall. That wall, filled with Emily's sketches, became a symbol of hope itself. What no one could deny was that Emily was changing. Teachers noticed her newfound energy. The driver saw her smile more often in the car. Even Richard's colleagues remarked that he seemed different, softer, less consumed by work. The truth was simple. Emily was healing, and in healing, she was healing her father too. She had been a fragile shadow of herself for so long. But now, because of one mechanic's kindness, she was slowly returning to the world. Daniel Brooks had fixed more than a chair. He had mended a broken heart. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, the air alive with the murmur of New York's elite. Men in tailored suits and women in flowing gowns moved gracefully across the polished floor. Yet, when Emily Carter entered, all eyes turned to her. She wheeled herself in with a poise that silenced the room. Gone was the timid, withdrawn girl many had whispered about since the accident. Instead, there, she was, her chin lifted, her smile radiant. Conversations paused, forks froze midair, and even the music seemed to soften in her presence. For the first time, Emily wasn't a symbol of tragedy. She was strength. Richard stood beside her, pride swelling in his chest. The powerful CEO had been applauded for business triumphs countless times, but tonight his applause was for his daughter. He had spent millions on therapies, flown across continents for specialists, and yet nothing had given her this glow. The truth weighed on him heavily. It wasn't science or money that had restored Emily. It was Daniel Brooks, the humble mechanic who had stepped in when no one else could. Richard's heart ached with both gratitude and humility. Guests whispered in hushed tones as Emily greeted them. "Is that really Emily Carter?" someone asked. "She looks so alive." Another remarked, "She must have found something medicine couldn't give her." Emily, once used to being pitied, now found herself admired. She navigated the ballroom smoothly, speaking with warmth and confidence. Some even approached her directly, offering congratulations for her courage. Emily blushed at their words, but deep down knew the truth. Her courage hadn't come from herself alone. It had been nurtured by Daniel's belief in her. Daniel wasn't dressed in a tuxedo like the others. His suit was simple, borrowed perhaps, but his sincerity made him stand out more than any silk tie. He lingered near the edges of the room, uncomfortable in such luxury but unable to take his eyes off Emily. When their gazes met across the crowded hall, Emily's smile widened. To her, it wasn't the glittering chandeliers or the applause of wealthy guests that mattered. It was Daniel's quiet presence, the anchor she had found in her storm. As the evening progressed, Emily participated in conversations that once would have overwhelmed her. She spoke about her sketches, her dreams, and even teased her father about how she might one day design a better wheelchair company than his entire empire. Richard laughed heartily, his heart bursting with love. But as the night wore on, Richard couldn't ignore the truth that pressed against his chest like a weight. None of this would have been possible without Daniel. And so, he made a decision. Later that evening, when the music softened and the crowd was absorbed in conversation, Richard quietly approached Daniel. His powerful frame, usually commanding and intimidating, now seemed almost fragile. He motioned for Daniel to step aside into a quieter hallway near the lobby. The chandelier's glow reflected in his eyes. But there was something else: tears. Richard rarely showed emotion, yet tonight he could not contain it. He looked at the young mechanic, a man who owned little in the world, and his voice trembled with sincerity. "You didn't just fix her chair," Richard whispered, his words thick with emotion. "You fixed my daughter's heart." His eyes brimmed with tears as he continued, "For that, you'll always be part of this family." Daniel stood stunned, unsure how to respond. He had never sought praise, never expected gratitude. He had simply followed his heart, offering kindness where it was needed. To be told by a man like Richard Carter that he was part of the family felt unreal, humbling him more than any award could. At that very moment, Emily wheeled closer, sensing the gravity of the exchange. She reached out and gently took Daniel's hand, her own eyes glistening. "You gave me back my life," she said softly. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything she had endured. The loneliness, the despair, the nights she thought she would never laugh again. Daniel squeezed her hand lightly, his throat tightening. He didn't see himself as a hero. He only saw a girl who had refused to give up, even when the world turned its back on her. From that night forward, Daniel's role in their lives was no longer questioned. He became Emily's anchor, her confidant, her greatest source of encouragement. They spent weekends sketching new ideas. Together, testing small inventions and even planning ways to help other kids facing similar struggles. Emily dreamed of starting a foundation to provide modified chairs for children who couldn't afford them. "We'll call it Hope on Wheels," she announced one afternoon, her eyes gleaming. Daniel laughed, but Richard noticed the pride swelling in his daughter's voice and knew this was the beginning of something greater. As months passed, Emily flourished. She returned to school with a confidence that stunned her teachers. She spoke openly about her journey, telling classmates that her wheelchair wasn't the end of her story, but the beginning of a new one. Daniel often joined her for school events, always quietly supportive, never seeking attention. To the students, he became a symbol of kindness, a reminder that one person's belief could change a life. Richard watched it all unfold, realizing with awe that Emily's story had become more than personal. It had become a message of hope. The Carter family, once closed off by grief, began to open its doors. Richard invited Daniel often, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just to talk. Their worlds couldn't have been more different, one built on steel and glass skyscrapers, the other on oil-stained workshop floors. Yet their bond grew from mutual respect. Richard came to see Daniel not as just a mechanic, but as the man who had restored his daughter's will to live. Emily, too, cherished every moment. The laughter, the sketches, the small victories, all of it was proof that hope was stronger than despair. There were still challenges, of course. Emily faced setbacks with her health, days when her body felt heavy and uncooperative, but now she no longer faced them alone. Daniel was there, reminding her that progress wasn't about walking again, it was about living fully. Her father was there, no longer consumed by business, but by the joy of simply being with his daughter. Together, they created a new rhythm to life, one filled with gratitude instead of grief, courage instead of fear. And through it all, Emily's smile never faded. The story of Emily Carter spread quietly at first, whispered among the city's elite. People wondered how the CEO's daughter had transformed so completely. When reporters asked, Richard didn't speak of money or doctors. Instead, he spoke of kindness, of the young mechanic whose heart was greater than any fortune. Some didn't understand how could a man with so little give so much. But those who saw Emily's radiant smile knew the answer. Love, friendship, and hope were not bound by wealth. They were bound by humanity. One evening, long after the gala, Richard found himself alone in his office, staring at the city skyline. He thought about the years of sorrow, the endless chase for solutions money could buy. None of it had worked. What had worked was something he could never have purchased: Daniel's compassion. Richard realized then that the greatest riches he could ever give his daughter weren't material. They were people who loved her, people who believed in her, people who reminded her of her own strength. For the first time, the powerful CEO felt small, and he welcomed it. Emily's journey wasn't just her own anymore. She spoke at small gatherings, inspiring other children with disabilities. Daniel often stood quietly in the back, never seeking credit but proud beyond measure. Parents thanked him, children looked up to him, and Emily always introduced him with a smile. "This is my friend, the one who fixed more than my chair." Those words became a mantra, a truth that spread far beyond New York. And in every retelling, Daniel's kindness became a beacon, a reminder that one heart can change another. In the end, Emily's life was no longer defined by the accident, the wheelchair, or the whispers of pity. It was defined by the courage she found, the hope she shared, and the love that surrounded her. Richard looked at her often and saw not a fragile girl, but a warrior with fire in her spirit, and standing beside her, always steady, always humble, was Daniel. Together, they had rewritten a story of despair into one of triumph. What wealth and power couldn't buy, a simple act of kindness had given freely, hope, friendship, and love.